All right, there's one more term you need to be able to work with in addition to the ones that you read about for today's lesson, and that's the idea of nation. First, just a real quick recap of the units that you read about, assuming that you did reading 1.2 before this very moment. O'Neill talks about three kind of levels of institutionalization at the looking at the state, at the regime, and at the government. And he helpfully arranges them on this kind of spectrum or pyramid from less institutionalized to more institutionalized, where institutionalized means something that's kind of likely to stick around for a long time, all things being equal. So the state is the most institutionalized, the most permanent of these levels, and it refers to this group of institutions or organizations that exercise political power. There's some other aspects to that definition that O'Neill talks about as well, but for comparative purposes, it's the existence of these long-lasting institutions which should persist from government to government. A little bit less institutionalized than that is the regime, which is the set of rules and the norms that govern politics, how power is gained and exercised. Those are often, but definitely not always, laid out in a constitution, and they tend to persist from government to government. But it's possible to have a state that changes regime, right? If it has experiences a revolution or writes a new constitution or otherwise fundamentally alters the way in which power is distributed and exercised there, you can have the same state with a different regime. The most temporary level, the one that should change the most frequently, if all goes well, is the government, which is a group of people that control the institutions of the state in any given moment. So that includes, in the United States, for instance, that's the president, that's the vice president, that's members of Congress, that's justices on the Supreme Court, judges in the federal court, it's people who work in the bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you refer to the government in CompGov terms, you're referring to that group of people that is in control of the levers of power at any moment in time. If all goes well, the government should change fairly regularly in a democratic system. The regime should be much harder to change, and the state should be the hardest of all to change. Comparative government usually is concerned when we're looking at state versus state, is usually interested in comparing states as the unit of analysis. That's often what we're looking at when we're making these comparative statements. But you will also need to learn a fair amount about the existing regime in each of our case study countries and about the current government and about recent governments in our case study countries. That said, there's one other word that frequently gets used in common conversation about politics and international relations as interchangeable with state that I need to define for you much more precisely. And just to add some confusion to your life, O'Neill in chapter 3, in a section that I'm not going to ask you to read, defines this term slightly differently than I'm going to do. And I think my definition, which comes from the College Board, is a little bit quicker and perhaps a little bit broader as well. That term is nation. For the purposes of AP Comparative Government, a nation refers to a group of people with a common identity. And in particular, in CompGov, when we're talking about nations, we're usually talking about a few different types of commonalities. A nation might be defined by its speaking a common language. It might be defined by adhering to a particular religion or set of religious beliefs. It might be defined by common race or ethnic identity. It might be defined by common aspiration, so what a group of people want to achieve collectively. And most importantly for our purposes, it might be defined by the sharing of a particular political identity. And I'll give you just a couple of examples to try and make that clearer. First, you might or might not in your life have heard the United Kingdom described as being a multinational state or a state comprised of four nations. The UK, thanks to a lengthy history, which I'll talk about when we get to that unit, is comprised of four nations called Scotland in the north, England in the southeast, Wales in the west, and then Northern Ireland, in the northern part of the island of Ireland, in case you couldn't figure that out for yourself. It's a little bit tricky to suss out exactly what makes a Welsh person different from an English person. That will get a little bit contentious. But at the end of the day, those people in those four nations generally share some commonalities with each other that are in part defined by language, in part defined by culture, and in large part defined by history. That doesn't necessarily mean, and this is an important point about the definition of nation, that those people don't also identify as being citizens of the United Kingdom or members of that particular identity group, just that they also have this national identity, which in some cases is compatible with identifying as a citizen of the United Kingdom. In some cases, as we'll see, it isn't. Another example is Quebec, which is a region of Canada which is predominantly French speaking, which historically was colonized by the French before being taken over by the English, and which has a substantial population of people who would prefer to be independent. So Quebec is what we call a nation without a state, in that it is a group of people who have common identity, common language, often many of them common religious beliefs in the form of Catholicism, and a common political identity, but that aren't unto themselves a sovereign state. And what you see represented here in the form of this delightful blue haired individual is somebody who is advocating very publicly for Quebec to become a sovereign state, in addition to a nation with a common identity. Finally, there are also some nations which are spread across multiple different states. So, one good example of that is the self proclaimed nation of Kurdistan, which consists of people who share the ethnic and linguistic identity of being Kurdish. And that's split across Syria and Turkey and Iraq and Iran and little bits of Armenia, and doesn't have, except for some parts of Kurdish territory in Iraq, a huge amount of political independence or autonomy. So this is a nation which is divided across multiple sovereign states, many of whose members, again, are seeking political sovereignty, are seeking a greater degree of ability to control their own affairs, but which at present doesn't have an internationally recognized sovereign state to call its own. Finally, two pieces of vocabulary related to the term nation that you also need to be able to use in this course. One of those is a multinational state, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's a state, so a collection of political institutions wielding power over a defined population in a fixed territory, whose population includes members of different nations. We've just talked about the United Kingdom as a good example of that. Another is Nigeria, which, thanks to I'll be critical of this later, this isn't the time to do it now, fascinating way in which the British decided to construct its borders, contains a huge number of different ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups, all of which might be considered different nations trying to live together and trying to share power within a single state. The other term you need to be able to work with is nationalism, and that has a couple of different meanings depending on the context in which you're describing it. One possibility is simply to say that a nationalist is a person who has pride in their nation, and you see this in a bunch of different places, but my favorite example for this course is always going to come back to the Olympics. And so here you see people with, again, fascinating, wonderful hair who are proclaiming their pride in the Chinese nation in the context of, I think, a diving competition in Rio in 2016. However, when you're looking at a nation that doesn't have its own sovereign state, nationalism might also refer to the desire of a nation to gain political sovereignty. One of the examples of this that we'll talk about in this course is in Scotland, which has a number of activists, not an overwhelming majority of the Scottish people by any means, but which has had a persistent movement over the last couple of decades to gain political sovereignty, to break away, to secede from the United Kingdom, and restore Scotland's historical identity as a sovereign state, as well as a nation with a common identity. You'll hear, just a warning, you'll hear these terms, state, nation, regime, government, used and misused in a bunch of different ways. I'll give you today some practice opportunities to try and fix the way that political commentators and journalists and people in everyday conversation sometimes use these terms differently than a way I want you to use in CompGov. But your life will be somewhat easier in this course if you pay a lot of attention to the way that you're using those terms, and try and keep them consistent as possible with those definitions from these lectures, from what we'll talk about in class, and from your textbook. Thanks. That's it.